The report that we've produced examines prospects for intervention in Syria in the current situation and looking forward to the potential situation that will occur after Assad has fallen. It does not advocate intervention. It simply lays out the potential options and the situation in which we might find ourselves in a position where intervention becomes necessary, and if it did, then how we would carry out that intervention. The options that I've considered in my contribution to the report include carrying out enforcement action against Assad's forces to prevent him from killing members of his population, and that would require direct military action, including airstrikes, possibly imposing no-fly zones, no-drive zones. Beyond that, we could be talking about assisting with stabilisation of the country after the regime has fallen, which looks at present as if it's imminent, as if it's not too far away. And then finally, the final area that I've looked at is the possibility of providing humanitarian aid by establishing protected zones or humanitarian corridors to relieve some of the pressure on the suffering civilian population in Syria. I think as we see the last throes, hopefully the last throes of the Assad regime, we might see an intensification of violence as he lashes out before falling from power. And then after that, I think we won't necessarily see an end of conflict, an end of violence in Syria. Unfortunately, I think we might see a continuation of that violence as the different factions which divide Syria seek revenge on one another, seek to assert authority over one another. And indeed, we're likely to see perhaps an Iranian-supported Alawite counter-offensive against whatever new regime takes over in Syria. So I think we are likely to see a continuation of violence, perhaps for a considerable time. One of the crucial areas that's covered is the whole issue of chemical weapons. And Assad has the largest stockpile of chemical weapons in the world, as far as we know. I don't believe he would be afraid to use those chemical weapons. And we've looked at what those weapons consist of. We looked at how they might be controlled. We've looked at the way in which they might possibly be used in this report. I think as things stand at present, that there is a degree of restraint being exercised over the use of chemical weapons by the Russians on Assad. And I think while that restraint exists, I don't think we're going to see Assad use them. But I don't think it would be outside his capability to do so. Nevertheless, I believe that we do still need to be ready to intervene should those weapons look as if they're going to be used or fall into the hands of extremists. And I think the only country that could intervene realistically then would be the United States of America. I don't think there's any appetite for intervention by any Western power at present, and I think we can understand exactly why that's the case. There are two major factors, I believe, which are restraining any intervention. The first one is the position of Russia and China. While they remain opposed to Western intervention, I think the prospects of that happening are extremely low. And the second aspect is there doesn't appear to be a really coherent, strong, prospective government ready in the wings to take over that we could back and that we could help propel into power. I think there's, we're still at the stage, I believe, where we're trying to assess and work out exactly what this opposition is and who are looking like the strongest players. And of course, the other aspect to that is whether or not we would want to get behind something that turns out to be even more reckless, even more violent as the current regime. Although I don't believe there is any appetite for intervention in the UK at present, whether it's in the Foreign Office, the Ministry of Defence, or in Number 10, we don't necessarily always choose which wars we're going to fight. Sometimes wars choose us, or as Michael Clarke put it in the introduction to this briefing note, that we're not necessarily moving towards intervention, but intervention may be moving towards us. And the kind of situation I'm thinking about here is if there is much wider scale, much deeper, unrestrained, unbridled violence against the civilian population in Syria, or indeed if Assad decides to use his chemical weapons. I think it may be we have no choice other than to intervene in some way. Whether or not the UK could take a part in that, I think, is pretty clear. If there was a Western coalition, maybe as a result of a UN resolution or based on a NATO operation, the UK undoubtedly would take part. We have to see Syria in a very different light to, for example, Libya. Syria is in many ways at the centre of a Sunni-Shia power struggle in the Middle East, with, on the one hand, Iran desperate to retain its influence and control over Syria, in part as a means of exerting influence in Lebanon over Hezbollah and similar organisations there. And also, on the other side, we have Saudi Arabia and Qatar, who are determined, along with Egypt, not necessarily allied to each other, but with a similar agenda of curbing Iran's influence and restoring more Sunni influence in the region. So I think potentially those factors have every chance of leading to a wider conflict in the Middle East, resulting from the civil war in Syria.